Welcome to our July web debate. As usual, we meet on the first Tuesday of the month to discuss topics in diplomacy, the practice of diplomacy and its varieties. The aim is to give food for thought to practitioners and scholars, and to give useful inspiration and advice for the next generation of young diplomats. The debate is organized by DiploFoundation in the framework of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. My name is Katharina Höhne, and I'm a research associate in diplomacy and global governance with DiploFoundation. Today, we look at sports diplomacy. We are interested in exploring the extent to which sport can be a tool for diplomacy and peace. We ask, what forms does sports diplomacy take? Who are the actors? Is it more than propaganda by other means? And to what extent can it contribute to peace? For that purpose, we have two distinguished guests, Dr. Simon Rofe and Mr. Sean Hamil. And we have Simon here, and I think Sean hopefully joins us soon again. So just to give a little bit of background for them, Simon is a senior lecturer in diplomacy and international studies, and the director of the Global Diplomacy Program at SOAS, the University of London. He has worked extensively on sport diplomacy as a concept and practice, including, for example, a special issue in the journal Diplomacy and Statecraft and two forthcoming books on the subject. Our second guest, Sean, is a lecturer in management at the Department of Management at Birkbeck, the University of London. He is also the director of the Birkbeck Sports Business Centre, which is an academic research center for the study of sport business. Both, from their various backgrounds, will give us an introduction into their work and thereby into sport diplomacy. And I see Sean is back, which is wonderful. Good to see you. So one thing for our audience, both Sean and Simon will give a brief introduction from their respective backgrounds. And after their introductions, we would like to open the floor for your questions. So please share your thoughts and questions with us in the chat window at the bottom left-hand side. Having said all that, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Simon for his introduction on sport and diplomacy.
Okay. Does that work a little better, everybody?
Yes, perfect.
Can you hear me more clearly now? Is that clearer?
It's perfect. It's really good now.
Okay. I'll start again. So thank you very much for your kind words, Katharina, the invitation, and I look forward to talking with you for 5 or 6 minutes before handing over to Sean. So what I was saying was about there being a sort of clear antecedent in the study of diplomacy in looking at sport and diplomacy, and I really want to address the question of why sport and diplomacy is worth studying in its own right. Now, there are various sort of case studies and examples one can look through, and if I was giving a sort of full lecture on the subject, I'd talk you through some of those issues in greater depth, and the idea of the relationship between sports people and diplomacy, and also about sport and non-state actors. But in the interest of time and not to hog the limelight, I wanted to really focus on one central image, which I think conveys why sport and diplomacy is so important. And that's this image that is a picture that I took during the London 2012 Olympics. And I hope you can perhaps increase the size of your screen to see the four flags that are presented across the image. So they have the International Paralympic Committee, the United Nations, the London 2012 flag, and the Union Jack of Great Britain. So in that sort of one snapshot, you have 4 different organisations that are at play in shaping a mega event such as an Olympics, and meaning that we have a range of different actors and processes working simultaneously to provide sort of the moment of the spectacle of the sport, you know, be it the Paralympics in London in 2012, but also provide the support, the opportunity, and what Jeff Pigman and Stuart Murray have called sport as diplomacy, the opportunity for diplomacy to take place at sporting events and around sporting fixtures. So in the International Paralympic Committee, you have a private organisation, a members club if you like, albeit one with a broad membership. The United Nations, a universalist organisation of states, albeit with other organisations involved. The London 2012 LOCOG Committee was, again, a private, temporary organisation designed with the sole purpose of delivering the Games. And then you have the state, represented by the Union Jack. So these four different entities all come together. And I think that's where sport and diplomacy has something of a unique quality. In no other realm of sort of cultural disposition or feature of global politics do such a range of actors and processes come together in such a public light. Because an event such as an Olympic Games or a Football World Cup, these are the sort of central communal points of many people's lives. And we shouldn't forget the profile that that gives. Now that gives a profile for many different causes, and some of those causes have been taken not in the realm of or moving towards a peaceful solution or anything towards that end. And one can think back to the 1972 Olympics and the attack in Munich as an example there of how these events can be hijacked. Equally, the attacks in Paris last year, where the Stade de France, as a football match was taking place, was actively targeted. Nonetheless, they do provide these opportunities for diplomacy and indeed for reconciliation. So the first match that France played after that attack was at Wembley and was commemorating those who'd lost their lives in those events. So I really think it's this confluence of processes, actors, and timeline that makes sport and diplomacy worth studying. Now, I barely need to repeat, but just for clarity, the sort of facets of diplomacy that I see as important here are about it being communication, representation, negotiation, and agreement. And these are the real things that predominate. There's a question mark in my mind about the role of the state, and others, scholars such as Jeff Berridge, who I'm sure we're familiar with, has put the state far more centrally to than I do in terms of diplomatic studies. Nevertheless, in terms of looking at sport and diplomacy, there are a range of issues here, and again, I won't dwell on them, but these are the kinds of examples and points and lead into a series of questions which I'll get to next as to why sport and diplomacy is worth studying. And I think one of the important things is that you may well have heard of by sort of references in popular culture to perhaps ping-pong diplomacy or the diplomacy of apartheid boycotts. And these are things that, to my mind, are not necessarily very well or very good examples of sport and diplomacy. They are sort of single issue items often, and perhaps overlook the processes that are ongoing in the relationship between sport and diplomacy. But again, happy to come back to some of those as they come up in the questions. And again, here are some of the questions that I posed about sport and diplomacy, and an army of PhD students could happily tackle. But nevertheless, they might provide sort of lift-off points for some of the questions that you have. As I say, I could go on and talk in more depth about a number of these issues, but I want to skip forward to a couple of contemporary issues that we have here. My slides are no longer working. Well, the image, I think, has been lost somewhere in translation, but here it was about the Sustainable Development Goals, the follow-on for the Millennium Development Goals, and the extent to which sport is a key part of the third development goal. And in that sense, I think it's important to recognise that we're here talking about sport as its contribution across a wide range of health, peace, development issues. There we go, let's come back up. And I think that's an important point to make here, because this is not something that's going away. This is something that's new to the study of scholarship and the way it's involved in policy making more broadly. So on that end, and to give Sean his time, I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Simon. I think it's probably best if I give the floor to Sean straight away, and after that we go into questions. And there are already some coming in, so looking very good.
So, hi everybody. Just a very brief introduction to myself. I worked in industry for a period, came to Birkbeck 22 years ago. 20 years ago, Sky broadcasting company tried to buy Manchester United. It was a group of us were interested in the topic about the sports role in the broadcasting market. We set up a research centre, and since then we've been researching the business support for 20 years. Now, to declare an interest, we at Birkbeck have done quite a bit of work with UEFA on various programmes. So, maybe you might want to take that into account. I mean, we like working with them. They're very professional, but obviously, to some extent, we're sympathetic to their vision. I was also for a period the director of an organisation called Supporters Direct, which promotes cooperative ownership of football clubs. And the advantage of that was that it gave me a good insight into the reality of the financial management of sport, which actually tends to be very poor and characterised by chronic loss making. Now, what is one of the most interesting aspects of sport is that it's actually an ecosystem, because I mean all stakeholders in society and politics are interdependent, but in sport the interdependence is highly institutionalized. So why is that? Well, for example, in sport there are multiple objectives. There are public bodies promoting participation, grassroots, public health. There are stakeholders, private companies running competitions, which are basically businesses, but also basically it's also a sport. But the interesting thing about them all is at the high level of interdependence. And even just to run a competition, there's a whole literature in the sport, in the economics literature, about the peculiarity of the economics of sport. This comes from a famous paper by an American called Walter Neal, called The Peculiar Economics of Professional Sports. And in a competition organisation, it's one of the few areas of economic endeavour where you actually have to collaborate with the people that you're competing against, the other teams, in order to produce the economic product. And that means that for example, the club can't deliver the product on its own. It has to collaborate with others. So right away, at the very basic level, there's a level of institutional cooperation which requires the exercise of bargaining, diplomacy, whatever way you want to call it. I'll just illustrate this in the case of UEFA. This is all in the public domain, so this is from a 2005 document, but it's still relevant now. I mean, this is their stakeholder universe, and so UEFA represents the 55 national associations of football in Europe. But within UEFA there's a body called the Professional Football Strategy Council, and its role basically is an institutionalized bargaining forum for UEFA to negotiate with the EPFL, that represents the leagues, FIPRO, that represents the players, and the European Clubs Association, that represents the clubs. In fact, the clubs now have representatives on the executive committee of UEFA. And then beyond that, because like most sports, football is organised on a global level, UEFA sends representatives to what's called the FIFA Council, which is the governing, it's the strategic decision-making body of FIFA. And another complication is the rules of the game, which are established by a separate organisation, the International Football Association Board. Now, the rules are they don't just impact on how you play the game, they impact on how the game is broadcast, they impact on commercial issues. You can't, for example, put an advertisement in the field of play because it's not allowed in the rules of the game. The other overlap you get is that the sports governing bodies put great emphasis on this idea of the autonomy of sport, that they're able to organise their sport without interference from external bodies like governments. I mean, this is a very vexed topic, but if you look at it in the context of European and world football, the decision by the European Court back in 1995 that Mr. Bosman, the Bosman case, which basically abolished national team quotas in domestic leagues and also allowed players to leave at the end of the contracts. I mean, that shows you how the sports sphere overlaps with the sort of wider governance sphere. And more recently, the reason why UEFA was able to introduce this financial fair play regulations, which basically says to competing clubs, if you want to compete in their competitions, you can't spend more than you earn. They basically had to negotiate in advance with the European Commission that this would be compliant with Commission rules. So, I've only got 5 minutes, but the point I'm trying to make is that sport is a globalized activity. It's organized on a globalized basis. It's actually very institutionalized as well. I mean, even with the current scandal around FIFA, you can only have one professional league in every country, and the reason for that is because of FIFA rules. If you set up an alternative league, the players would not be able to play in FIFA, UEFA competitions, and neither would the clubs and the national. So, it's already an area where, in order to manage it effectively, there has to be a high level of bargaining internally. And as I've already said, there's already, the highly interactive bargaining with global political diplomatic institutions. The other thing about sport is, in order for it to work effectively, it has to have legitimacy, because if you look at the heart of the economic value of sport, it's uncertainty of outcome. So that's why live broadcasting rights are more valuable than highlights. Anything that undermines uncertainty, say like doping, match fixing, etc., anything to do with corruption ultimately undermines the economic value. And there was an interview in the Irish Times with Patrick Nally, who was the guru of sports sponsorships last week, where he basically argues that the various scandals that the previous regime at FIFA caused have had a really serious impact on the sponsorship environment. So I'll stop there, but if I was going to summarize it, I would say make 2 points. I mean, first of all, there is a very complex institutionalized diplomatic and bargaining process within the various sports systems, because they're all organized on a globalized basis as a hierarchy. And in order to maintain their autonomy or legitimacy, they also need to maintain good relations with external stakeholders, particularly governments. So I would argue, as somebody external to the academic diplomacy community, that the sport field is already one where diplomatic skills are at a premium. And as far as the title goes, new diplomacy and peacemaking tools or propaganda by other means, I'd say both. There's real diplomacy. I think that sport can be used to promote peacemaking, because, as the Scottish police used to say when they were trying to target difficult groups, teenage offenders, kids will come and attend a class in a football stadium when they would never come and attend one in a conventional classroom. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Simon and Sean, for these very brief but very thoughtful and targeted introductions into this wider field. Let me go into questions. We have one question from Stefano Baldi. Stefano Baldi is the former director of the diplomatic training of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in his question, he goes very much straight to one of the core things that critics of things like sport diplomacy, education diplomacy, other kinds of diplomacy often go to. And he says he's very interested in knowing what is the overlap of cultural diplomacy and sport diplomacy. And that's obviously a question aimed at Simon to a certain extent. And if I may add to that, Geoff Barrett, for example, who has already been mentioned, Professor Barrett, who also teaches for DiploFoundation, he often says that things like public diplomacy or cultural diplomacy are in essence propaganda, and we should recognize them as propaganda. And so in that sense, and also going back to the title for
be a success. You know, you don't have to be the fastest, the quickest, score the most goals or have the most points to be able to have an impact. And I think in that sense, there is clearly, amongst any political animal, of which our state officials often are, and an opportunity for them to be associated with great causes. But equally, sport has such a connection with people, and often some of the most visceral and emotional moments are something that politicians cannot replicate. So, the collective experience of, in the British case, or is it indeed English case, forgive me, Sean, of losing a penalty competition to Germany is always traumatic for English football fans. It's a recurring theme, but it provides a point of resonance that other experiences don't. Sometimes, for the World Cup, for Euro '96, or even just last week in the under, be they supporters of a team, an individual, or because they participate. And I think often the participatory nature of sports is important. The fact that you can go out on your bike, you can go for a run, you can play in a local environment, gives you a connection and an opportunity to have something to say to colleagues who are many millions of miles away possibly. And that is something that sport provides that other forms don't. Now that also exposes a somewhat crude underbelly of sport, and the issues that Sean raised around match fixing and doping certainly do tarnish that image. But nevertheless, you can, and I'm sure many of you will recognise, you can strike up a conversation about sport more easily and, in frankly more pleasant terms with someone, you might be sat next to at an airport or in a bar, rather than, the state of the nation, politics, whatever else may be going on in the world. And I think because sport has that quality is why, it is both the appeal to, political animals, and also has the sort of resonance with vast swathes of cultural affinity, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Thank you, Simon. There's something that you, Sean, mentioned in your presentation that I wanted to come back to, because
did everyone get that?
Yeah.
Take?
Yeah. So the question for Sean, picking up on his presentation, is in one of your slides you said sport is sport, and that is the underlying appeal, that there's a certain autonomy to sport which makes it a special kind of activity. And I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit before we move into questions more related to peace and identity in sport.
Well, the way I would answer that is to paraphrase Rupert Murdoch, the media tycoon. I mean, when Rupert Murdoch was trying to break, well, he was establishing Sky B or Sky in the 90s. He basically, his argument was that there were, it wasn't his argument exclusively, but this was the argument that if you wanted to sell pay-per-view, you basically had three options. I mean, you could pornography, which had moral and regulatory challenges, and really wasn't a legitimate route. Pay-per-view movies, but by the time you knew what to buy, they were already fully priced, which is why he vertically integrated into buying a Hollywood studio. And the third was sport. People like sport. There is a mass market for elite sport everywhere in the world, whether it's cricket in India, football in Europe, Latin. People like it. People like participating, and they like watching it. And the broadcasters, who are very sensitive to this, recognize that, which is why they pay so much for the rights. And I think that that's what gives sport its real power, actually, is that it captures the attention of the mass market, and it captures the attention of the mass market because people like it. And to go back to why we have international sport in the first instance, originally soccer was codified in England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, but with slightly different rules. And then I think it was in 1886 the four associations came together to come up with one set of rules in order to allow international competition, because the public wanted international competition as well as club competition. And that's the enduring appeal of the Olympics and the World Cup and all these other league competitions. Now, I think that's what I mean when I say it's a sport first, because that's what draws people to it. Now, what happens then is that it is used for different purposes. It can be used for purely sporting purposes. That was the old idea. Well, it wasn't partially the ideal of the old Olympic movement, but it can obviously be abused for political purposes, famously or infamously by the Nazis in 1936. I mean, in a more sort of modern context, every one of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have staged a mega sporting event in the last 20 years as a demonstration of their economic coming of age with varying levels of success. I mean, one of the legacies championed for the 2012 London Olympics, which Simon's referred to, is Britain can do it. London can do it. If you want something. No. So I think that's why it's important. I don't think actually that sport is that much different from other areas in terms of the various uses it can be put to. It's the critical thing about it is its absolutely fundamental place in popular culture globally, and its ability to deliver a global audience. That's the power. And the proof of that is why the broadcasters and now the new media operators spend so much money, and that's why it's attractive to political forces of every hue.
Thank you. I think that's a really good comment, which leads us also back to the discussion that's happening in the chat right now, because many participants in the chat have been starting to ask questions related to the peace function of sport, because very often when we discuss sports diplomacy, we tend to focus on bringing people together, peaceful relations. There are a couple of things I would like to relay back to you. There is one question from Atif Ahmed. He says, or he asks, what is needed first to make sports a bridge for mutual peace between Arab countries and the Israel state? Which is a very interesting question and a very important one. Also, what I would like to relate to you are two examples from Professor Yolanda Spies, who's based in South Africa. One example she gives is, she says, North Korea's rejection of new South Korean President Moon's proposal that the two states co-host a major sporting event is a good example of sport diplomacy. Not successful sport diplomacy, but attempted sport diplomacy. And then later she also gives an example from South Africa, where she says, in South Africa, our hosting and winning of the Rugby World Cup in 1995, just after our transition to democracy, was an extraordinary moment where South Africans came together under the iconic leadership of Nelson Mandela and projected a unified image to the world. So these two things, I would be interested in hearing some comments, perhaps from both of you, on this relationship between the peaceful function of sport, but also perhaps the dark side, so to speak, where sport is about competition. Because another comment from our director, Dr. Jovan Kubalia, points out that in the Balkans, for example, the war, he says, was announced on the sporting field even before it was officially announced. So these kind of comments and reflections and this one question, over to you for your reflections.
Simon?
Well, I'm happy to have a stab at the South African question and to start with. And I think the point that Yolanda makes around the imagery of that competition was stark. On the one hand, the most iconic image, made famous by Matt Damon in the movie Invictus, is of the captain, Francois Pienaar, being presented with the trophy from Nelson Mandela wearing a Springboks rugby jersey. And only a rudimentary understanding of South Africa's internal sporting heritage tells you that a black man, in the first instance, wearing a Springboks jersey is a remarkable thing, and that being presented to a Afrikaan of Dutch origin, imperial project in Francois Pienaar is quite remarkable. The important thing about that also is that it's the image that went around the world, but also the internal image. I think what that did to the Rainbow Nation, and speaking to a number of South Africans about that, and however cliched it may have become, it still is an important part of their contemporary history. On the other hand of that, and again, whilst that is the overriding image of that World Cup in terms of its legacy, there was just one black athlete on the rugby team, and his inclusion in the team to perform and to ultimately beat the New Zealand All Blacks was controversial, not necessarily because of his race, but because of the connotations around his representation of an entire black community. And South African sport has been faced with these challenges ever since, really, of the number, and it's come down to having strict quotas imposed on the sporting federations of the number of indigenous Africans being part of various sports teams. So both in terms of cricket and football and rugby, there is legislative requirements for degrees of racial inclusion, and that again betrays the legacy that sports and the sort of screen on which South Africa's issues were portrayed through sport. The boycotts of the 1970s and 80s of rebel touring teams of English, West Indian cricketers, of New Zealand rugby players, all of this contributed to the context by which that image of Nelson Mandela mattered so much to South Africa, but also to the broader context. And I think it speaks to the imagery of that. And equally to jump back to Joran's point about the wars in the Balkans, one of the most telling images there is of Zvonimir Boban, a footballer of no little talent who went on to play for AC Milan, attacking Serbian police whilst playing for Dinamo Zagreb, a Croatian team, whilst the police were attacking the Zagreb fans. And quite right to point out that some of the least savoury, in a particularly unsavoury conflict aspects were individuals were recruited directly from the terraces of the likes of Red Star and Partizan Belgrade into Arkan's death squads. So, and that's not the only instance either. Simon Cooper's book on football wars is very good at this, having a look at this and telling the tale of how conflict is manifest in sport, particularly football in that regard. But I think equally we need to have an opportunity sport does have lots of opportunity in it, but we need to have a reconciliation or realization that it is also a dark side, as you suggest. Over to you, Sean.
I mean, I think that it has a dark side and a positive side because it's just a reflection of the world we live in. I think that one of the positive things about sport is that, particularly at the elite level, it's played out in a very public forum, and actually it's a difficult place to hide in. And we're even seeing with the sort of doping revelations at the moment, the allegations, well, not just allegations against Russia, that you have a habit, even Lance Armstrong, you have a habit of being found out. And it comes back to this central point about sport. It's about, people want to see a competition to see who's the best, right? They want the fair competition. And if you are able to deliver a fair competition, that you're demonstrated a competency, but there's also a sort of the virtuous halo. And I think the problem for a lot of organizations, say for example now, looking back at the Sochi Olympics in Russia, the doping, it's tarnished, and it has a wider impact. And again, in my slides I refer to Patrick Nally, who's the marketing guru of sport, who says that the bladder era, the reputation, like there's a phrase in Irish politics among the old discredited, with the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland, Charles Howe, in the 80s, who was sort of irredeemably corrupt. But his followers said, sure, everybody's at it. In other words, it's the natural order. I mean, it was followed by years of institutionalized investigations into corruption. But the thing is that's almost like an argument. They would say that, wouldn't they? But I think the thing is, in the real world, actually, reputation does matter. And in sport, it matters particularly because really, it's all about, at the end of the day, are you better than the other man or woman on a level playing field basis? And I think that the danger for political forces who abuse sport is it's a very public place to be caught abusing this ideal. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of sport. There are obviously more important things like human rights, basically economic, the level of, economic well-being. But I would come back to this absolutely central point. There is a mass market for this particular field of human endeavour. People want to watch it. They want to consume it. Part of the problem, I would argue, as somebody who's worked in sport business for 20 years, is there's an extraordinary snobbery in academic life towards sport. I mean, if you were running an arts management program to run a theatre 15 years ago, no one would it would be regarded as totally legitimate at a mainstream university. Whereas sports management is really something to do with physical education and not really intellectual. And I would refute that completely. And I think that, but at the same, so I think that what happens is that the significant, like for example, the Minister for Culture, Media and Sport in Britain before in the period before the London Olympics was known as the Minister of Fun in some newspapers. No one says that anymore after the triumph of the London Olympics. And I think that, we don't want to exaggerate its significance, but I think diplomats in particular need to recognize that it has a bigger significance. And I think, you need to look at the broadcasters. The broadcasters absolutely value live sport far more than they do TV drama. And I think the intelligentsia, for want of a better way, I like theatre, etc. myself, and I went to a couple of decent universities, but does highbrow culture really have the diplomatic power of an event like the FIFA World Cup? I would throw that question back to you.
Mm-hmm.
And just one last point on this. Why have Qatar set up a sports broadcasting network, beIN Sports? A very shrewd move, in my opinion. And there would be no Sky broadcasting without Sky Sports. They could not have financed a news network without the pay-per-view subscriptions from the sports channel. So
thank you, Sean.
It's much more complex.
Let me get into two more questions. What I picked up from your point, which is very interesting, is this question of fairness and legitimacy of sports, especially when it's organized on this large scale, which is very important for diplomacy. And there are two more questions. Actually, we have more questions, but I think there's room for two more questions to bring in before we need to conclude. One question comes from Sean Reardon, and he asks, are we distinguishing between sport as a tool that helps the pursuit of broader diplomatic strategies, and sport as an arena of human activity which throws up problems which diplomacy has to deal with. So more of a conceptual question and distinguishing maybe between different parts or different kinds of diplomacy or sports diplomacy. And then one question which is quite important, I think, especially in this context, which is the question of what is your advice for developing countries in terms of sports diplomacy, to maybe have a better profile, to maybe widen their scope. So with these two questions, and maybe we can tie these two questions in with your final words and your conclusion for the debate. And I think I'll start with Simon.
Shall I come in on the development line? I think there's a vast swathe of literature about sport development and peace, and the United Nations set up and then recently shut down its own department on sport development and peace, handing that responsibility over to the IOC. I think what we're looking at here, sport does have an opportunity to bring people together, and going back to the Arab-Israeli scenario, there are numerous initiatives and often very successful examples of the young children playing together, Arab and Jewish children, and then as the state starts to take hold of them, through processes of quote unquote assimilation during their teenage years, and particularly the Israeli state's insistence on national conscription, puts things in a place where those competitions over sport are no longer able to take place. Not necessarily out of ill will, particularly, but just because the state's influence on that scenario is fine. So I think the opportunity for development exists in various contexts. One can look at the Premier League's Premier Skills campaign and the way it sends out coaches to different countries as a means of putting people's, impacting upon people's lives. I think the idea that development is a natural consequence of sporting endeavours is not something that is necessarily true. And you need to recognise, we should always recognise that some of those projects have, had an immediate impact. Some of them have had a longer term impact, but the evidence overall is that their impact on development is, marginal at best. And I think that's, an important function of what sport can and can't do, recognising its limitations. To sort of echo some of Sean's Reardon's remarks, actually these are, in that sense, how different is sport? And while we might have a different conversation about it, in the realm of development, I don't think it is particularly. I think if it's opportunity for contribution to diplomacy, it perhaps is. But the development line, because of the works of the likes of Richard Giulianotti at Loughborough, that talks about how sport and development can advance development. My cynicism or critique of it is that it's case-based. There's not an overarching framework which says this application of this much money, send this many coaches, this many footballs, and there's a development bounce, and that's development field more broadly. So.
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on development, right? And my interest is in internal governance of sport organisations and how the system functions. But I mean, I would just go back to my earlier point in that sport has developed organically right across the globe. So whatever it is, there's I think it's 211 members of FIFA now. And most sport governing bodies have development functions. I mean, FIFA now, the FIFA Forward, initiative. It used to be the Gold Project. And when they invest in countries, there's a response. I mean, India was regarded for a long time as a soccer-free zone, except in areas around Calcutta, etc. But it's developing there because there is an appetite for it. And I think that, I mean, I don't work in the diplomatic field, but I mean, my view on this is that it's a little bit of a sort of a theological argument. I mean, people enjoy sport. Particularly a sport like soccer. It's very easy to play. It develops organically. It has governing bodies which develop it, and it's generally agreed where you have higher levels of participation. If you can achieve that, you have higher public health outcomes. And I think the other thing about sports clubs is that they do develop social capital. Now, I mean, because one of the original reasons for the enthusiasm for sport organisations in England in the 19th century was because a lot of people who were involved were evangelical Christians, and they thought it would take the working class away from dissolute lifestyle of drinking, etc. But there was also a view that you wanted to keep your young men fit to fight the next war. I think that sport, I keep coming back to this because I think it's a central point. I don't think sport necessarily needs development agencies to get involved with it to help it to do what it's doing. I think the appeal is there. I think the real issue is to stop it being abused. I think that people will always play forms of sport because it's an enjoyable, healthy thing to do. They will always want to see who's the best, so competitions will always emerge. And then what happens is that other institutions in society get involved, and they can either use it for good or for ill. I just think the whole debate about is sport a valid mechanism for development? Well, yes, it can be, but it's only a small part of the process. I mean, I'm more interested in. Let me finish with this one point. The entire financial system of the world economy almost collapsed in 2008, and yet the global sport institutions continued. FIFA, for all its problems, still runs the international football transfer system, which works. It's a rare example of a very successful global regulatory system. WADA, for all the criticism that it's achieved, is developing a global competence in fighting drug abuse in sport. I mean, I think that those are real achievements. They're institutional achievements. And I think what's at the back of it all is that there's a very big consensus that says we want international sport that's run competently. And maybe the learning could be the other way. Maybe the UN was right to hand over competence to FIFA for development in sport, because maybe FIFA is a better vehicle, a more effective vehicle for it. I mean, I'm not an apologist for the international sports organisations, but what I would say is they're under-researched, they're misunderstood, they fill the papers when there's a major scandal. But they have a durability and a resilience which I think we can learn from. And again, I come back to the central point of all the stakeholders. It seems to be that the broadcasters are the ones that really appreciate this the most. And I think that is very telling.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Simon, would you like to come in for last summarizing words in 1 minute, perhaps?
This is Simon.
Yeah. But I think he might have a technical issue there. Well then, let us wrap up then. So, yeah, I think it's time to wrap up. So, thank you for being with us today, and especially for the thought-provoking and sometimes challenging questions and comments in the blog. Most importantly, of course, I want to thank Simon and Sean for sharing their insights and guiding us through the world of sport and the world of sports diplomacy. As always with our web debates, the recording and summary of the debate will be available within a couple of days. One last thing, if you would like to stay up to date with the work we do at Diplo, you can subscribe to our newsletter, and I'm going to put the link in the chat window below. So thank you so much for being here with us. We had a good number of participants, and as I said, really challenging, thought-provoking questions. And most importantly, Sean and Simon, thank you for being here. And I mean, my impression is this discussion could go on much longer. So maybe we need to find a different forum to discuss these things further. Thank you so much.